Hi guys, this is day 14 of the AS Economics 42-day revision challenge, and today we are going to do subsidies. So how do we define subsidy? Well, subsidy is a payment to firms by the government aimed at lowering their cost and therefore market price. When we give a subsidy, we say subsidy is like a grant given by the government, and when we give a subsidy to the producer, it results in basically, let me write this, it results in the supply curve to shift out. So the supply curve of the firm will shift to the right when you give a subsidy to a producer, and the goal of the subsidy is basically to have increased production because the cost of production goes down, the quantity of the producer should go up, and that also can sometimes result in the price of the good to go down. Before we talk about the diagram of subsidy, let's talk about why subsidy is given to start off with. So, why subsidy? Well, government gives subsidy for a variety of reasons. The first reason we say why government would want to give subsidy is simply to make the good cheaper for consumers. So we have poor consumers who may not be able to afford the good, and if you want to sort of make the good cheaper for the consumers, we need to give subsidies so as the government makes it more affordable for people to buy that good, which otherwise will not be affordable for poor consumers. So the first reason why we give subsidy is simply to make it cheaper for poor consumers who are unable to buy the good otherwise. The example could be healthcare, it could be education, could be any merit good or even necessities. So that's one reason, which is to make the good cheaper. The second reason why we want to give subsidy is basically simply to have more production of a good. So increase the production of some goods. What are these goods? It could be your merit goods, it could be your sort of necessities, it could be any good that the government feel should have more quantity to be supplied, or rather more quantity to be consumed, and as a result of this the government would want to sort of make it more or incentivize the producer to produce more by giving him this subsidy. So any environmental friendly sort of car would be given a subsidy by government, for example, so that a producer can make more of that good. The third could be a reason where sometimes government gives subsidies in order to make sure that they make some sectors or some income group to benefit. For example, subsidies are sometimes given to farmers to increase their income. So increase income of producers. So these producers basically will benefit when you give a subsidy in terms of higher income. Lastly, we can give subsidy in a market like international market or in a market where we are giving subsidy to domestic producer in order to make them competitive against the foreign producers. So increase the exports or reduce imports by giving subsidies to domestic producers. So when the domestic producers get it, the subsidy, their price can be lower than either the foreign producers which are selling in the domestic market, or even if they are exporting, then they become more competitive in the foreign market. So subsidies sometimes is given in the international trade context as well. Let's now look at how demand and supply will be for subsidy before and after subsidy. If this is my demand and supply before subsidy, let's say this is market for some agricultural good, and the government decides to give a subsidy to make the good to be cheaper. So if P naught and Q naught is right now the equilibrium price and quantity, and the government decides to give a subsidy, we know the supply curve will shift to the right like this. When the supply curve shifts to the right, supply curve will become S dash, where the new subsidy is calculated on the quantity Q1. So on Q1, the vertical distance AB is the amount of subsidy. So this AB vertical distance between the two supply curves is the amount of subsidy. What's my price after subsidy? And the answer will be where the demand meets the supply curve, and my new price after subsidy will be P1. So if the consumers were previously paying like $10, and let's say now the price is $8, we notice the vertical distance is much more than this $2 subsidy. In fact, let's say the subsidy is $4. So this vertical distance AB would be, let's say, $4, and let's call this P2 price to be $4. P2 price to be, in fact, $12. So what I'm saying here is just that when you give a subsidy, the price of the good will go down, but not by the whole amount of the subsidy. Just like taxes, in this case, what happens as well, that price the consumer was previously paying was $10, but after subsidy, the price he's paying is $8, which means $8 is what the consumer pay, $4 is what the government gives to the producer. So overall, producer is now getting $12, and this $12 would mean that 12 minus 8 is this vertical distance AB is your amount of subsidies. Let me write this: vertical distance AB is your amount of subsidy. Makes sense? So what is the consumer paying before? And the answer is consumer is paying before is $10. What is he paying now? And the answer is $8, because that's the new equilibrium price. What was the producer getting before? And the answer is $10. What is the producer getting now? And the answer is $12. So we can now look at what we call consumer and producer surplus and figure out the welfare of these producers and consumers before and after subsidy. Let's try to label all these areas. Let's call this area 1. Let's call this area 2, 3, 4. Let's call this bit to be 5, 6, and 7. So this is area 1, this is area 2, area 3 is this triangle, 4, 5, this is 6, and this one is 7. So before subsidy, my consumer surplus is area 1 plus 2. Why is that so? Well, because the price is P naught, so before subsidy my price is P naught and the quantity is Q naught. So before subsidy, if the price is P naught, area under the demand curve above the market price is basically area 1 plus 2. While because the price is P naught and the quantity is Q naught, area under the market price above the supply curve is area 6 plus 7. So producer surplus will be area 6 plus 7. Now, when you give a subsidy, let's write after subsidy. When we give a subsidy, my market price will be P1 and my quantity will be Q1. So what will be my consumer surplus? My consumer surplus will now be area 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 6. And why do I say that? Well, look at this. Market price is P1. Your demand curve is till Q1 is like this. So all this triangle, which is area under the demand curve above the market price, is my total consumer surplus, which is 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 6. On the other hand, my producer surplus will be basically a little tricky, because now producer is now getting the price P2. He's no longer get P naught, he gets basically P2, which is basically why, because the price the consumer is paying is $8, but the producer is pocketing more. He's pocketing 8 plus 4 more. So producer basically is effectively getting $12, which is P2. So all the area under this price P2 below the supply curve, above the supply curve will be the producer surplus, which is going to be 3, in fact 2 plus 3 plus 6 plus 7. So what is important to note here is that although this is my supply curve after subsidy, but this is an artificial increase in supply. The true cost for the producer is still going to be this white curve. And therefore, from a producer perspective, when he look at his producer surplus, he will go back to this supply curve. So Q1 quantity, this is my supply curve, P2 is the price, so 2, 3, 6 and 7 will be my producer surplus. So in other words, you can see this, the consumer is benefiting by this much as compared to before. He's benefiting by this much. 6 and 7 is the rise in his sort of surplus. 5 plus 6 is the rise in his consumer surplus, while for producer, the rise in producer surplus will be this area 2 plus 3. So P2 minus P0 is the benefit a producer is pocketing per unit, and P0 minus P1 is what the consumer is benefiting. And therefore, this red region for 5 plus 6 is what we call the rise in consumer surplus, while this 2 plus 3 is the rise in producer surplus. What about area 4? Well, we say area 4 is the deadweight loss of a subsidy. And why is it going to be a deadweight loss? Let me write this, a deadweight loss of a subsidy. The reason is simply because the cost of subsidy is greater than the benefit of subsidy. What is the cost of subsidy to the government? And the answer is, well, the government is paying P2 minus P1, so $4 times Q1. So 2, 3, 5, 6, and 4, all of this being paid by the government. So therefore, cost of subsidy is area 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6, while the benefit is simply 2 plus 3 plus 5 plus 6. So the shaded regions are the benefits. The total cost is P2 minus P1 times Q1, which is basically P2 AB P1. So therefore, this means if I cancel 2, 3 and 5, 6, I will be left with area 4, which is not going to any party. So because the cost of the subsidy is more than the benefit, we say there are some deadweight losses that happen. So ultimately what we look at is that when we give a subsidy to the producer, the price of the good goes down, the quantity goes up. Consumers benefit in terms of higher income as the price is now that they're getting is much better. Producer benefit in terms of lower prices, which is also good for them as consumers also. So consumers get lower prices and therefore their consumer surplus go up. Producers benefit in terms of higher prices and therefore producer surplus go up. But the government is paying the subsidy and therefore the cost of the subsidy can be a problem when it comes to subsidies.